Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. This is episode 14 of the Web Platform Podcast. Your hosts today are myself, Eric Isaacson, UX engineer at 3 Pillar Global, and Danny Blue from Deloitte Digital, front-end engineer. And we're lucky we have a special guest today, Rob Dodson from Google. He's on the Polymer team, and he'll be talking with us today about web component interoperability and Polymer, as well as other flavors of web components. So welcome, Rob.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. We had set up something to talk about Interop as far as XTags, using web components, and Polymer. So can you explain what Polymer is generally and how this project started?
Yeah, absolutely. So Polymer is a library which does kind of like two things. It polyfills support for web components and browsers that are missing those features. And then it also adds kind of like a layer of some tactical sugar to web components so that it makes it kind of a faster, more efficient process to build your own web components.
Danny and I are pretty strong advocates for the web component standards. We have used them for our own private projects and as well as prototyping. Here at 3 Pillar, I've done a lot of prototyping and experimenting with Polymer since, after the I/O talk in 2013. As far as people coming onto the show for the first time, they may not have heard of web components. Can you give a high-level overview of web components and Polymer in particular, the history of all of this?
Yeah, so I could explain kind of like the whole reasoning behind why even the Chrome team started it. Basically, the Blink engineers had been, along with some other folks, been working on this idea of how can we improve the component model for the web, and came up with sort of the notion of web components based on earlier ideas that I think Microsoft had been working on. I think there was a thing called XBL or something like that. But basically, this is an idea that this improved component model for the web has kind of been kicking around for years, and the problem is that it's a big complex change that we're proposing. It's actually like 4 different things that we're trying to add to the web platform. And so I guess at this point, maybe 2 years ago, Alex Russell and a few other folks came up with this notion of the extensible web manifesto, basically saying that the current way that we're adding things to the browser is we propose a feature on a mailing list. There's a ton of back and forth discussion that goes on these mailing lists. The discussion is pretty in the weeds often, or pretty out there. Something that the average web developer is probably not that engaged with. After a ton of bike shedding, you eventually end up implementing something in the browsers, getting some consensus, writing a spec, implementing it in all these different browsers. And this whole process takes years. And only when things have reached the point where they're working in a bunch of browsers do the actual web developers, the person the product's actually being designed for, get to touch this new thing. And then at that point, you start to get all this negative feedback, and it's oh, well, now it's too late to change a lot of these things. And app cache is sort of a wonderful example of that, of something that when people finally got their hands on it, they were we don't like using this. And it's oh, oops, well, we just spent a ton of time implementing it. And so the idea with the Extensible Web Manifesto is, well, let's see if we can flip that on its head. Let's see if we can polyfill new features before they've shipped. We'll give developers access to much lower level primitives in the browser so that they can build these powerful polyfills. And then, that way we can kind of iterate on these new features. Developers can experiment with them before they are, super, super baked and in every browser and at a point where it's difficult to change them. So that's really been the strategy with Polymer. And now you've got other things coming up behind it, like Service Worker, which follow this same idea of let's get things in developers' hands as early as possible using polyfills so they can actually put them into production even given the right constraints, and that way get very realistic, very rich feedback on these things that we're proposing. So that's kind of the backstory of where Polymer came from and why, in particular, the Chrome team is really interested in it.
When the DOM was built, my understanding is that it was more for adding pieces of text, and it wasn't really built for heavy animations or visual UI. At that time, they foresaw some of that, but that's my understanding of it. If I'm wrong, please correct me. You know, there's other ways of thought as far as taking the approach of avoiding the DOM altogether, like React and Famous has sort of tried to do, to abstract that and then flatten the DOM as much as possible and inject it only when necessary for changes. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting point. Matt McNulty, who's the engineering manager for the Polymer team, has this sort of like anecdote he likes to tell about that. So the Polymer team used to work on another library called Enyo, and at the time when they were working on Enyo, the whole they had basically the exact same notion. They were like, the DOM is slow, let's never touch the DOM. And the way Enyo worked was you would, put together your component in JavaScript, and then it would just kind of inject it all using inner HTML as like a big string, because that was sort of assumed to be the fastest way to do it. And when they came over to Chrome, the team was like explaining to the Blink engineers how they wanted to build components, and the Blink engineers were like, no, like inner HTML is not going to be faster than just like working with the DOM. And they were like, well, yeah, it is. And they were like, no, like that's how it used to be, but we've been doing work to improve the performance of the DOM, and now the DOM itself is going to be faster than inner HTML. And so I think that what's happening now is we're actually really heavily investing in the DOM and making sure that we are making it fast. So the long-term strategy is that we can make the DOM fast, and we don't have to build this like whole system that sits on top of it and only uses it like as a rendering layer, and basically like forgoes all the APIs that are there. And that's really the strategy that we're trying to take right now with Polymer and with web components, is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. We think we can make the DOM fast, and then we don't have to put a universe on top of another universe, because that is going to suck.
Very cool. So with Polymer, it's been out for how long is, like, I guess you'd say the release as it exists now, how long has it been around?
The current release, or just Polymer itself?
Its current release.
I think we're on 0.42, and I believe, I'm like firing up GitHub now. I think it went out 2 weeks ago, maybe a week or two ago. We have like a brand new release that's fairly recent. I'm gonna say I'm gonna guess 2 weeks ago.
Okay. So there obviously been a lot of improvements since Polymer first came out into now, but what are some of the kind of the rough edges that are still in Polymer right now, or like the more difficult parts to get into?
The rough edges. Okay, so there are a few. Some things I'm actually really happy with, because I feel like they're starting to get quite stable. Like I feel like Polymer itself is getting pretty stable, and the underlying specs are pretty stable at this point. Like I remember when I first started at Google, I wanted to write a newsletter on Shadow DOM, and every time I wrote down to write a draft and get it edited, by the time all the edits had come in, Shadow DOM would change. So do you guys remember like how like all the different selectors for like : part and cat in the hat, and like there was all this like crazy stuff, and it was all like it only lived for like a month or two. So all of that is like really settled down, which makes me quite happy. With Polymer itself right now, I think the thing that we're primarily working on is improving the performance of the elements that we have shipped. So we built these two big element sets, core elements and paper elements, and we're trying to make sure that we're lowering the construction cost for those elements so that you can use a bunch of them on a page and it's really nice and efficient. In particular, the paper elements use a ton of effects, like shadow, like there's shadows all over the place. There's a lot of animation that they have packed into them. And we did this on purpose to really see like, what's the boundary and how far can we push it? And I feel like we've made some really awesome elements there, but What we're working on now is making sure that you can have a bunch of them on the page and it doesn't slow things down. And that's really specific to the paper elements. The core elements tend to be okay. The paper elements, just because of all the additional stuff that we've included in them, can slow down a bit, and we're actively actually paring those down right now. So in the 0.4.2 release, we kind of cleaned up a lot of stuff, which is why we had a few API breaking changes on like paper button. And paper button, I'm trying to remember, there was maybe one other, but paper button was kind of the big one. Other than that, we're working a lot on accessibility. Improving accessibility. So that's something that folks kind of got mad about at I/O or after I/O. They were like, hey, we're trying to navigate around your demos and they're not super keyboard accessible.
Right.
So we put out this new thing called Core A11Y Keys, which is an element to help with keyboard accessibility, which is really nice. Yeah. And Addy is working on a new guide to accessibility. He wrote like a part 1 for his accessibility guide, which is up on the site right now in the articles section. But he's now working on part 2, which I believe uses core A11Y keys to actually like build a little app and to really show that off. We've got this really cool like virtualized list component called core list that's getting like a ton of love right now. And it's getting like a major facelift, and I'm really excited to see people play with that because I think that's going to be pretty hot.
What is it? What is it again?
It's called core list, core-list.
Okay.
It got a big update in 0.4.2. It's going to get more updates in some future versions, but it's basically like a virtual list that scrolls infinitely. So you can you can connect it to a model that has like thousands of rows, and it'll just like scroll like super fast, which is really cool.
So you say it's infinite scrolling on a list, which is really useful for mobile. Have you guys been working closely on the performance for that?
Oh yes, that is like, so Kevin, the guy who's working on this right now, that his desk right now is just littered with like iOS and Android devices, in particular iOS devices, because that's been sort of a reoccurring issue for us as people are complaining about performance in mobile Safari.
Yes.
And so we are very actively looking at that and trying to improve that. So that's another rough edge, right, is mobile Safari performance. And what I can say to that is that we're working on it. We've got some things, sort of like some skunkworks projects, which I'm not sure if they will ever see the light of day, but there are hopeful, promising little rays of light in there. So we're focusing on it, and we're definitely going to improve that, I hope, in the coming releases for sure.
One of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you today was interoperability with web components. And Polymer is a big part of that because, at the lower level with platform, even you're sharing it across other libraries like XTags. And actually, I'm not even sure if XTags is using it because they have a total new version, and they've split Brick out. So there's a lot of new things that have happened recently as far as the other ecosystems. I know Basonic is going through a total revamp. And we saw your San Francisco HTML meetup group. It's been out for a while now, where you did the presentation on Interop, and it was really great with the mashups. Can you talk about the benefits that you can gain as developers for using multiple sources of components?
Yeah, absolutely. So the benefit is that today we live in this world where you've got a few major, you can call them frameworks or libraries, that most developers use to do their work. You've got like Angular, Ember, Backbone, React, Famous now, I guess. The tricky thing is if you build a really awesome component in one of those frameworks, then it's not available in the other ones. And so we are very siloed in that sense, and we have probably like 100 date pickers that are floating out there instead of a handful of really good ones. I mean, I'm sure all of them are quite good, but we're not focusing on a limited set of components. Instead, every time a new framework comes out, you've got to rebuild your component library in that new framework. And it's kind of a big waste of time, and it makes it very difficult for us to really nail down and focus on like mobile platforms and things like that, where it would be nice to have a handful of just very highly performant elements. So the whole idea with web components is that if you're building those components using the web platform, then you can share them across any framework. And now all these authors don't have to come up with their own component system. and so at the SF HTML5 meetup, what we showed off in that video was just taking Polymer, taking XTags. I don't think I used a vanilla web component in there, but you totally can. You can use something that's written not using any library, but just the sort of the underlying APIs. And you can mash them all up together. And that's really, really powerful. And in fact, in the talks I've been giving lately, I took a bunch of Brick elements, Brick 2.0, which is built not using XTags now. Brick 2.0 is using just vanilla web components. And I combined that with a bunch of Polymer elements to build kind of like a fake Firefox OS app. And it's awesome because you get these component libraries. They have their different look and feel. They have their different behavior. There's things in the Brick library that I really wanted that were not present in the Polymer library, just like a card for like swiping through content. We have that now. It's called Core Animated Pages. But at the time, I really liked the Brick version because I felt like it was very simple to use. And so I started grabbing different components that I wanted and mashing them together. And it's a really, really effective way to work because you basically spend all of your time just figuring out what do I want my app to do versus the logistics of, how do I get this jQuery plugin to work inside of this Angular directive, to work inside of, what have you. Like, it's nice when you just kind of can clear all that stuff away and just be grabbing things out of the toolbox, which is sort of the goal here.
What are the pain points you might encounter in something like that?
Where you're likely to run into trouble is the earlier version of XTags did not have support for Shadow DOM, and so in the demo that I did, I actually had to write a style sheet specifically for the XTag component that I was using. I had to edit their style sheet so that it worked with Shadow DOM. Bosonic, I don't know what they're doing now with their rewrite, but the original version of Bosonic did not work with native Shadow DOM. It worked with, it would basically take all of your styles, run them through the Shadow DOM polyfill, and then output like non-Shadow DOM styles, if you want to think of it that way, as if you're working in a legacy browser, which is cool, but then they stop working once Shadow DOM is turned on. So that was kind of a problem with Bosonic, and I'm hoping that they're fixing that. So I guess what I just mentioned twice was Shadow DOM. That seems to be the thing that crops up a lot as being one of the tough parts for developers. Brick 2.0 uses Shadow DOM now, so it works well with Polymer. I believe XTag, the current version of XTag makes Shadow DOM an option that you can enable, so that would work well with Polymer and other components. Still don't know about Bosonic, and I also don't know about the future of XTag. I'm not quite sure how Shadow DOM will work into the next release of of XTag. If they're going to make it a full-fledged member, they'll keep it optional or what. But yeah, to me, that's sort of the main thing is still Shadow DOM.
We have a show scheduled for XTags coming up soon. Some of the developers on that, and Brick as well. So we'll definitely look into that. We did have Bosonic's creator, Raphael Rougeron, on. He talked about the Shadow DOM and basically how Bosonic's view of the Shadow DOM being that it's more compositional than about encapsulation. They go around it to avoid the performance hit. So a lot of the issues have been resolved, but there is still one issue outstanding that I can see on GitHub, which is transpiled CSS fails to correctly style Shadow DOM nodes for browsers with native implementation number 4. But there are very few open issues left on Bosonic, which is good news because that means that the newer release will probably come very quickly. He's been using React with Bosonic a lot. It's interesting to see the approach he's taking with the different polyfills.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating because the underlying standards like template, custom element, Shadow DOM, HTML import, they're all really interesting and useful on their own. And so Polymer has kind of like an opinionated way that we've knit them together, but by no means is it the only way to work with web components. And that is kind of one of the really fascinating things. I think that I haven't done a very good job of not conflating web components and Polymer. And there's a lot of people out there who think that to use web components, you have to use Polymer, which is not the case. And you don't have to do it the Polymer way or anything like that. You can just use the individual standards however you want. And there are interesting use cases that pop up from that. GitHub, for instance, only uses custom elements. They don't use any of the other standards. And so they've actually got custom elements in production, which is really cool. And they didn't want to use Shadow DOM or imports because they felt like those were still worked out a bit.
And you bring up standards too, and that's one of the recent things I posted across like every web components community I could find is that Internet Explorer, Microsoft actually has recently opened up a poll for developers to shape how the next version of IE platform will work. And as we know, nothing is supported yet from web components in IE, but all 4 of the major pieces of web components are in the top 10 to 20 of these requests that people are voting for. So you go in, you have X amount of votes, and you can, post a feature that's not there, or you can vote up a feature. The community seems to have an adoption of web components even in the IE space. And my questions would be, what are the potential impacts on development with that if IE adopts those specs? And what would Google do to help promote the adoption in other browsers or devices?
I mean, I think it would be huge if IE picked up web components. It's definitely like a common question that I get where folks are like, when can I use this without the polyfills, for instance? Like today, you can use web components in Chrome without the polyfills, which is really cool. Like you can just use Polymer JS if you want in Chrome. You don't have to load the polyfills at all, and it makes everything a lot faster. And Firefox is also kind of like on the edge of shipping these things too. I think if IE jumped on board, that would be awesome. I feel like that would really like swing the pendulum. And I don't know. I really, really, really hope they do that. I mean, and so speaking about like what is Google doing to promote this? So our team, the Polymer Eng team, as well as the Blink team, meets with the folks at the different browsers. So we meet with the folks at Mozilla. We've met with the folks at Apple. We've met with the team at IE before, and just like sat down, had lunch, and talked about like what are their concerns and everything. The IE folks have been asking really good questions, implying that they're taking an actual like deep look at it. Some members of the win.rs team actually did like a little Polymer project just to kind of like play around with the idea. So I was actually really stoked to see that IE developers poll, and a little bit surprised, but very happy surprised to see that when the question was put out there to the community, like what do you want to see IE implement, web components just shot to the top of the list. I feel like that is a signal that this is something that when developers do try it out, they're like, hey, like this really does improve the ergonomics of my workflow. I would like to see this everywhere. So yeah, I'm really hopeful that in a future version of IE, they can put that out. It's definitely, what is it, status.modern.ie. They're all under, marked as under consideration right now, which is good. I hope they get on board, and we're definitely trying to encourage them and work with them if at any point they need help or want to reach out to us. We're always happy to talk.
I had a discussion on Twitter back and forth about Internet Explorer and the pain points. And people say all the time, developers get up and say, well, forget IE9, just use Chrome for everything. And it's, if you're a professional web developer, you can't tell people what their audience should actually view in.
Yeah.
It was a very frustrating thing to see. Even in this poll, one of the top things for a while, one of the top features that was posted was stop IE, just use Chrome. And people were voting that up. And I was shocked. I'm like, this is the first time Microsoft has actually said, hey, developers, we want your input. Even though we have closed source, we want to see what you want. We want to understand our users better and our developers better. Have you experienced that at all?
Yeah, I mean, Google gets the other side of that, right? Like that Google's trying to like take over the world. And I think in particular because the web component standards got implemented very quickly or got kind of like pushed through the process very quickly, a lot of folks felt like we were just trying to force our agenda on folks. But really the fact of the matter is we just really believe in this, and I feel like the mobile web is having a really tough time against native apps. We need to be pretty aggressive about trying to address that problem. And so that's why I think everyone on our side was really adamant about getting the standards pushed through. But then there's blowback associated with that, and people feel like you're just forcing your will on folks. And it's the same thing with Microsoft, where I think that people feel like IE kind of burned them for so long that now they're like, I can't take you back, IE. It's like it's kind of like a weird like jilted lover thing or something. But I haven't had like a ton of experience. I'm still very new to DevRel, developer relations in general. I haven't had a ton of experience working with the IE DevRel folks, but I actually just went down to Brazil with Jonathan Sampson from the IE team. He's also new to their team, and he was just telling me that like they're really trying to like open up. They're really trying to do the right thing, and you're seeing that now through like status.modern.ie, through the poll that they're doing. They're really actively trying to engage with developers a lot more. I feel like they are totally heading in the right direction. They started putting out a beta channel, I believe, of Internet Explorer, which is awesome. So yeah, I mean, I feel like I think that developers are probably going to come around and start showing IE some more love as they continue to be more open, more transparent, get out there and actually like interact with developers. You know, I think that's what most people want, is they want to feel like their opinion is being heard by the browser makers. And so good developer relations can go a long way there.
That's awesome. I mean, it's always good to hear when things are getting better. We've already mentioned XTags quite a few times, and can you tell us a little bit about your work with Mozilla on like XTags imports and the stuff that's changed since the latest releases of it?
So XTag imports is a little GitHub repo project where it was basically like a setup for the SF HTML5 talk that I was giving. Like I really wanted to show off the use of XTags and Polymer in the same project, and I just found it, it was like kind of a pain in the butt to have to not use HTML imports when Polymer uses it, and XTags could totally use it. So I worked with Aaron Shar from the XTag team, and I really like all I was doing was taking all of the script and style dependencies that you have to normally include yourself with XTags and just putting those into an HTML import and making sure that those imports imported the correct dependencies as well. And they were like, super cool to do that and to work with me on that, which is really fun. I think that now that Brick 2.0 is moving off of XTags and moving entirely onto just the polyfills that ship with Polymer in the platform.js file, that it should be even easier now. I believe now they just support imports. I'd have to double check. Like Brick 2.0, you may be able to just like import what you want, and you don't even have to use the sort of the shim layer that I created with XTag imports.
Awesome. One other thing that both of us have been very interested in with web components in general and Polymer are that the first things that you think of that make a lot of sense are UI components. So, especially, like the paper elements are a great example of that with, the buttons and the checkboxes and, other things related to UI, especially at I/O, there seemed to be a pretty big push for non-visual components. I know there's a core Ajax element and other things like that. Are there like best practices or patterns to follow if you do want to create components that are not for UI, that are for API connection or something like that?
Yeah, to your point, we have these non-visual components. Core Ajax is the one that gets held up a lot as it's sort of like, it's like contentious. Like people see Core Ajax and they'll flip out on Twitter. They'll be like, oh, facepalm. And then I'm like, no, it's awesome. Just to explain really quickly, like Core Ajax, all it does is it bundles up an XHR request for you, and you can configure it. You can be like, okay, your URL is this. You like go handle the response as JSON. You can just give it an attribute handle as equals JSON or something. And you can drop it inside of an element, and it'll just go and make the request on your behalf. Now, a lot of people see that, and they're like, I can already do this in JavaScript. Why would I ever do this in markup? And the reason to do it in markup is because you have data bindings now. And so you can actually just bind that response very easily and declaratively to some other like list or something like that. So this thing just like auto fires, fetches some JSON, and then populates a list. And you don't have to actually write any JavaScript glue code to handle that. You just do it all with like a data binding. It's really nice. It's just a little declarative data provider, and I love it. But people initially see it and they freak out. But yeah, I think that there's just this like massive opportunity to take a lot of these things that we've been doing, behaviors, but also, like you said, working with APIs and turn those into components. And it's like really useful. Like Google Map is the one that we show off so much because there is a lot of boilerplate associated with connecting to the Google Maps API and actually just playing around with it.
Yes, there is.
Yes, there is. And it's so much fun to just put like a Google Map tag on your page and just configure it with like a few attributes and you're done.
Yeah.
And like if you need to, you can like poke it like with a method or something. but you don't have to go through setting up all of the like just all the junk yourself, like listening for the client library when it has loaded, the like ready callback and all that other stuff, right? You can the element's just taking care of that for you. It just fires off an event when it's ready. So the one thing that is tricky is in the case of a lot of the Google APIs, we need to load a client library, and it's like, well, what do I do if I have 3 Google Map tags on my page? Each one of them is trying to load the client library, right? So suddenly you've got 3 things all requesting the same file. How do you manage that? We actually created an element called, I believe it's called core shared lib. It's basically like a little pub sub thing where the first element on the page that gets upgraded is like, yo, I'm gonna go load in the Google Maps API, and everyone else is like, okay, cool. I'm just gonna like hang out and register myself with the publisher. You let me know when that has loaded. So as soon as it gets loaded, it notifies all of the different elements on the page, and they're like, okay, cool, now I can start setting myself up. So that was probably the biggest hurdle that we ran into, was how do you deal with all of these elements that all want to talk to the same API, but no one element knows who should be in charge of loading the API boilerplate. So if you check that out, core shared lib, there's another thing just called Google-APIs, which is sort of like our more polished up version of that approach. I'm trying to think about other stuff. I mean, right now that's still a very experimental place for us,
Yeah.
like loading in APIs and everything. We're still sort of figuring out all the best practices. So far, like we've seen really interesting adoption of that. Like within Google, there's a lot of teams that are now kind of like poking their heads up, and they're like, hey, like we can take all of our crazy boilerplate and just mush that into a tag. Like we're into it. Yeah. So we've been talking with a lot of folks internally to get them kind of excited about that. Maybe I really hope that some of those elements are going to start popping up in documentation for some of those services soon. But it's just a lot of interested people, but that would be really cool.
Yeah, no, I mean that's great. I mean, kind of using custom elements is kind of an elegant layer of abstraction from all that boilerplate is very, very appealing to us here. Because one of the first things you learn how to do as a web developer is put markup on the page and add attributes and stuff. And if you can you don't have to you don't have to learn an API pretty much. You can just change an attribute and have other stuff happen. So it's a really, really interesting area. One of my favorite things about web components is, Polymer throws its own syntactic sugar on top of this, is the ability to extend off of the existing elements. You do it vanilla, there's a little bit of boilerplate because you have to make sure you're using the correct, you have to set up your prototype chain and stuff like that. But the fact that you can take, the example that everybody uses is taking a button and turning it into a mega button, or something like that. But the idea of extending off of existing elements, existing elements that or like a button, or extending off of or of another custom element that you have made or maybe or something like that is a really, really powerful like OO style concept that's really just now making its way into HTML markup. I seem to get really excited about it, and nobody else does. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that functionality, both in Polymer and just in regular web components, and why it's so powerful and important?
Yeah, so in web components, you can now, basically this is just a byproduct of custom elements, the custom element spec that lets you specify, hey, I would like the prototype for the custom element that I am creating to inherit from this other element's prototype. Like every custom element that you create actually takes the HTML element prototype and extends it. But you can get more specific, and you can extend something like, in the example, we always use HTML button element, and now you've got all the sort of properties and methods that has. And when you incorporate Shadow DOM into the mix, it gets especially interesting, because then you can be like, I want to take this component, I want to extend its prototype, and I want to like grab all of its Shadow DOM, all of its like hidden markup, and inject that into myself and render that as well. So you can get pretty out there with it. What I found in practice is that extending UI elements and actually trying to display their UI again can get sort of like tricky, because you don't have very fine-grained control over the UI that you're projecting there. you have this thing called like a shadow tag, where you're basically like, okay, right here, just like slurp in that previous element and make it display. But you don't have very fine-grained control of the DOM of that previous element. So changing it can be really tough. And so what I found to be the most successful, and this is also pretty evident in a lot of the Polymer elements as well, is where we tend to do inheritance is when we'll start with like an element that doesn't really even render UI, or if it does, not very much at all, but usually it doesn't really render much UI at all. And a good example of that is core selector. And core selector is basically, it's really just behavior. And it's like, if I have children and someone clicks on one, I'm going to add a class to it. And that's it. It just basically handles the behavior of add a class to one of my children and remove it from all of my other children, which is a pretty common thing to do with like a menu or something like that. Then we just extend that element kind of all over the place, like paper menu, paper tabs. I think some of our other elements just extend core selector, and they're like, I want that same behavior of being able to toggle one of my children, but I will now implement my own UI for that. So in practice, I think that if you're doing something that's very UI heavy, it's probably better to compose things together. If you just want behavior though, then inheritance works really, really well. I think longer term, what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out a better way to let you work with the DOM of the element that you've extended. But right now that is still kind of in its infancy. You only get that one shadow tag right now. And so I think that we're going to have to improve that before doing like really, really deep UI extension is super practical. So at the moment, I would say build a base element that has behavior, extend that, and that'll actually get you pretty far.
Awesome. Perfect.
Have you encountered any issues across the different libraries built on top with extending, like Polymer or XTags or even Brick?
I mean, if I was trying to extend like an XTag element or something?
Yeah.
I've never tried to extend an XTag element. That's an interesting point. I only usually extend Polymer stuff because that's what I'm interacting with mostly. It should work. You might have to actually set it up yourself. Like you might have to I don't know. That's actually Polymer should be able to do it. This is like I'm gonna go try this as soon as we're done now.
It's like your example too with Brick, right? You had this thing in Brick. I think it was the swipe that you had said from the mobile, or the card swiper.
Mm-hmm.
That you really liked, but you didn't have it in Polymer. So you're like, oh, I want that. Rather than building it from scratch, you could start with what's already there, by extending that. Then in theory, you could change the markup or whatever you needed to do in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I should be able to have extended that tag so long as I kind of knew what it was looking for in terms what its internal JavaScript was looking for, if it's looking for particular classes on its children or something like that. As long as I set that up on my end, that should all still work. So that'd be an interesting and fun experiment to try. Yeah, I kind of want to do that now.
And we had Zenarocha talk about customelements.io and also the web components community in general. And he had talked a little bit about generator element, which generates vanilla, Polymer, XTags, even Bosonic, I believe. What are your thoughts on the approach for this type of building for production-ready apps?
Like using generators to build stuff?
Yeah, for web components, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I helped put together the generator element, like some of the kind of the early app structure. Like Zeno and I worked to figure out how in the heck are we going to set up the grunt task for this thing so it's easy for people to share it on Bower later, because you have this whole tricky canonical path thing that you've got to do with HTML imports with the whole relative paths or else things get weird. So we worked on generator element together. I think that is awesome. I actually personally work on the generator Polymer for Polymer specific applications. And what I've been trying to do there is take the best practices that we are learning about building apps and codify them into the generator so that people don't have to kind of learn all that stuff themselves and then have to assemble it themselves. For instance, we see a lot of people who don't use Vulcanize, which is the tool that we use to concatenate all of our imports together. We see a lot of people just don't use that. And it's probably not surfaced very well in the Polymer documentation. I know it's not surfaced very well in the Polymer documentation. We're going to improve that. But a lot of people skip that step. And So what I did was I just made it like an integral part to the generator. So if you're using generator Polymer right now, like it will always vulcanize your stuff for you. It's not something that you add in or opt into. It's just doing it. And I think that those are very useful ways to, like, best practices are those things where you kind of know in the back of your head, you're like, oh yeah, I should use image optim to optimize all of my images. But if it's not already set up in your project, then it's kind of a pain to like stop what you're doing and redo your grunt file and like integrate that into your workflow. And so if it can already be set up for you in advance, I think that's really good. Like, I'm not saying developers are lazy, but I have heard that phrase thrown around a little bit, and I can attest to it myself personally. And so when things are already just sort of set up for me and ready to go, it makes it a lot easier to leverage best practices. So I think it's a good approach. If you're building something in production, start off with like a generator that's up to date. It's going to try and get you off on the right foot, and then hopefully things will be a lot smoother for you.
Yeah, and that one's updated pretty frequently, so that's pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we keep all of them pretty up to date.
When I talk with clients about web components, I'm always pushing that I think it's a great way to build. When I push it, there's a lot of pushback on that as far as, well, it's not really production ready. And I think that may be why that perception may be the reason why we don't see Vulcanize used as much, because to me, Vulcanize is more of a production tool. You wouldn't really care when you're testing it in development as much as you would when you're deploying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a production tool. I mean, it's definitely good to get into the habit of using it as early as possible, but the primary purpose is, yeah, you're ready to ship this thing to the world, so you vulcanize it as the last step. Just like, uglifying your JavaScript, for instance.
Definitely. Throughout the history of web components and Polymer, we've been through a couple of IOs and lots of demos, and we had like Polymer Elements before we had Core We had Polymer Labs, I think, which is still there. There was Polymer Development or Polymer Developer or something like that on GitHub. And there's a lot of these one-off type of, component playgrounds. What are the ones that people should be looking at, not just with Polymer, but across the whole ecosystem?
So I think the place to find things is still customelements.io. That has been kind of like, it has weathered the storm, if you will. And webcomponents.org is going to be getting a lot more attention from us in the near future. We are working on some kind of like tune-ups to the design, but we are also just planning more content for that site. So those are going to become more and more important, I think, as kind of like bedrock for the community. And they're not specific to Polymer. They're specific to just general web components, which I think is really good. If you're looking for playgrounds and things like that, the core elements and the paper elements, like those are not going away. The Polymer Dash and Polymer Dash UI elements were always experiments, and I don't think we maybe explained that as well as we should have at the time. There was definitely like a long period of people getting off of the Polymer UI elements, and they still pop up occasionally. But the core elements and the paper elements are here to stay. The best place to really track those is on the Polymer site itself in the elements section. I'm really interested to see what the Brick team is doing. Like they've reshuffled a lot of things, and now Brick 2.0 looks like it's really happening. And in particular, I'm interested to see if there's going to be some future point where Brick and Firefox OS are used more heavily together. Like I don't know if Brick is actively being used inside of Firefox OS or how that's actually shaking out at the moment. But I'm pretty interested to see like where they're headed with that, because Brick is getting updated now. It's getting some love, and I'm hoping that means that it's going to be showing up in Firefox OS more. The guys at Dipshot, Michael Blay, I hope I'm saying his last name right. I don't know if I am. But he put together a really cool site called Built with Polymer, where you can just see a bunch of sites that people have been building, which is kind of cool for getting inspiration. And he also built this tool called ele.io, ele.io, which is kind of like JS bin for web components. It's already got the platform and everything kind of loaded for you, and so you can just like go on there and like hack and make a little component. It's really fun, and it's kind of a nice place to experiment with ideas before maybe you're ready to like commit them to a project or something.
Yeah, Dipshots an interesting company. They're a small team and they're able to do some amazing things. Michael Blay's blog is incredible. We had the pleasure of having Scott Corrigan, their lone node developer, come on to read the source.io, which is a monthly Google Hangout we do on open source to discuss, like to go through the code and figure out what are the intricacies of running with this code. Something we started when we had trouble with Angular early on. It was really great that they're so willing to come out into the community and do great things. And we're hoping to get them on the podcast to talk about what they're doing in the web component space as well.
I'm super, super stoked to have those guys as part of the community because it seems like every few weeks they just like pop up and they got some other cool thing that they built. They're really killing it.
One big thing, so we've talked about Shadow a ton so far on this episode, and so it's been one of the really big things about elements is kind of the encapsulation of everything inside of them. So from the styles to the code, all that kind of stuff. So there are quite a few ways that sometimes you need to communicate between elements, and there are a few different ways that you can do that. And is there a way that you think is quote unquote best, or just a way that you would rather handle if you have two elements that you need to communicate with each other?
I guess there's two patterns that seem to pop up the most. The way that I think is probably ideal for most situations is rather than having two elements kind of like know about each other and talk directly to each other, imagine these elements are siblings, for instance. Like that can get kind of messy. And so the thing that we tend to recommend is if you got two elements that really need to communicate, it's probably best for one element to like fire off an event that the common parent of both elements can listen to, and then it can decide, okay, this guy over here needs its sibling to do something based on this event that I just heard, so I'm going to go poke the sibling. That's, I believe, also sort of similar to the React model of, let some common ancestor drive the changes in your application versus having things talking directly to one another, because that can just become a mess. The other thing that pops up, which I kind of mentioned earlier, is sometimes you do need to use kind of like a pub sub pattern, in particular in the case where you're working with like an API and you've got to have a bunch of elements know, we all depend on this common resource, so we got to know when it's ready. So everyone just subscribes to the notification, and then they all get hit at once when that thing has loaded. So I think those are probably the two primary patterns. We had this thing called Core Signals. I guess we still have it, which is sort of like a pub sub tool, but I would recommend being careful how you use it and leaning more towards having a common parent drive elements than having everyone just firing signals at one another, because that will get confusing at some point.
Yeah, and the Flux model from Facebook, they have this unidirectional flow, and the dispatcher is sort of like that one parent you're talking about, which would decide what it knows about everything, but the other things don't know about it. So it's an interesting model as far as using other frameworks and integrating with the components. If you're used to a particular framework like Angular or React, why and how could you do this?
There's been a couple adapters that have popped up, and I can put the links in the show notes. There's today you can already use Polymer with Angular in a sense. You can kind of have like a one-way relationship there where Angular is driving the behavior of a Polymer element, but it's not able to data bind to the data coming back out of the element. And so someone wrote an adapter to enable that. Similarly, someone wrote this thing called, what is it called? It's called, I think, React Elements or something like that. I'll have to dig up the link, but someone built a adapter for React. The long-term plan that the Angular team has been publicizing lately is that they want to move Angular over to web components. So they put out a doc recently on Twitter where they were like, we want community feedback on web components and kind of how you imagine Angular would work with web components. So I'm hopeful that a lot of these frameworks just move to adopt that as their component model, because it's going to be there as part of the platform for free, right? It's just going to be there. And so it makes sense to leverage it and get the performance boost that you're going to get from things running natively versus having to create your own component system and layer that on top of the platform. So I think long-term, I think right now we're still kind of in the early days, but long-term I see this becoming just a part of other frameworks and libraries that we already use.
I mean, the Angular doc, I've read through it. The biggest thing that stuck out to me was properties. So typically you'll talk with attributes on your elements, and you'll interface that way, or you'll use events. But the way that Misco, I believe, talked about it was using properties.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. Like I was just doing a project with the jQuery UI team. TJ Van Tol from that team had kind of started porting bits of jQuery UI over to web components, and we kind of had a similar issue where most jQuery plugins, when you set them up, you pass it like a big configuration object. Like you don't just set a bunch of attributes on the tag that's going to become the host for your jQuery plugin. You usually kick it off with this big config object. And they had kind of a similar concern where they're like, well, what do we know is, what part should be attributes, what part should be properties? We're not sure. And how does the developer know which to change? They really wanted it to be, all of one thing, for instance. They wanted it to be like all properties, I think. So yeah, I mean, that's one of those really interesting thorny problems that I think we're going to have to just sort of work through by actually maybe implementing and experimenting with a little bit. The current, sort of contract that everyone has with working with HTML and the DOM is that you've got these tags, they have attributes, the attributes let you configure them, but then you can always select the underlying element in JavaScript and poke a property. So we do sort of have this like split model at the moment, and it works, pretty well. The entire web is built on it, but I don't know. Like I'm basically like I don't know if there is a solution that I have in my head already about how to fix this. So I'm kind of interested to see what other people experiment with and come up with.
Yeah, I mean, another big takeaway was that Angular should not know about the web components innards, right? It shouldn't know about any shadow DOM or anything inside of it, which makes total sense. But if you needed to affect something, using the data binding would be a bad idea, and to use properties instead. But it's all a document. It's all a document right now.
I was going to say, I want to go back and reread the doc. I haven't read it in a while. I read it like a month ago, maybe. But I want to go back and breeze through it.
I'm interested to see what you've been doing lately with Polymer and web components. I know we talked a little bit before this about your screencasts, Polycasts, which is awesome. And you also have another project that you've been working heavily with. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So first, just to touch again on Polycast, like we just started this show, which is up on YouTube now. And probably the easiest way to find it is just to go to YouTube and type in Polycasts. I'm going to start embedding the episodes in the Polymer website itself, so you'll start seeing these like popping up. You'll see my beautiful face popping up all over your browser. So Polycast is basically like, it's kind of inspired by Railscast. Like Railscast I always really enjoyed because they, Ryan Bates would just take like one topic and focus on it and explain it in about like 8 to 10 minutes, and then boom, like you knew how to do form validation in Rails or something. And it's really concise, and I really like that. And web components lend themselves to that really well. You can explain individual components, and we're sort of starting there. We started off with icons because they're so simple and easy to grok, and then we're starting to build those up. So now we're looking at toolbars, and some of the future episodes that we're recording right now, we're kind of building more like layout-centric stuff, but we're combining the things from the previous episodes because that's just how web components work. You just start composing things together. So it's a really cool experience working on it, and I hope people check it out. And the other thing that we're working on is in the month of November, all around the world, we're going to be asking Google developer groups to run a big Polymer event. And the event is called the Polytechnic. And the idea is that we've basically put together, a bunch of material for the events themselves: stickers, swag, code labs, slide deck, stuff. Or it's kind of like a little event in a box, if you want to think of it that way. And we're asking folks to run it throughout the month of November, all over the world. It's crazy. We've already got like so many signups from places like everywhere, like every single continent, I guess, except for Antarctica is represented, which is so exciting. Yeah, and it's just like it's a place for folks to go, and if you're totally new to Polymer, you can go and check it out, and you can do some code labs and get up to speed. If you're already familiar with, it's very focused on Polymer, I should say. We explain web components, but this is primarily a Polymer thing, so you're going to be building with Polymer the whole time. But if you're new to Polymer, you can learn it. If you're already familiar with Polymer, there's a lot of stuff in there to teach you about like the Google services as APIs, also showing off like the Yeoman generator, things like that. So there's something for everyone, I hope. And the website for that is itshackademic.com, and we've got a map up there so you can start to find like local events that are happening near you. Right now, I think we have like 160-ish people who have like event leaders who have said they're interested. We only have a handful of those moved over to the map, but there will be lots more coming on the map that's on the site. So if you're in an area and you don't see an event there just yet, be sure to check back in maybe like a week or two, and that map's going to be filling up really fast. So I'm super excited about that.
So can any company or group organize one of these, or does it have to be like a registered type of Google?
Anybody can organize one, and all of the material to organize one is on the site itself. For stickers and basically for like swag like that, we have been primarily just doing that with the Google developer groups because there's like a standardized process that I can deal with to ship like 15,000 stickers around the world, and it's a lot harder to do if someone is not already in that workflow. If there are like really large events though that want to run a Polytechnic, they can probably just contact me directly if they want some swag. But for smaller events, that's the one thing we probably aren't going to be able to support is sending everyone like swag, just because it's shipping and everything kind of takes a little while, it takes time and everything, and I don't think we really have the resources. Basically, like I'm the one running this event, and so I'm not going to be able to scale to support the whole world, but I can do the Google developer groups, and definitely the material is there if anyone wants to run one themselves.
One of the big things with web components since I've started that's been a pain point is testing. And we've talked about this before, but could you explain how you're doing testing now and how you think that you can test mashups as far as like, different types of web components?
Yeah, so we've actually been working on this quite a lot lately because I don't think anyone on the team is super satisfied with the current testing approach, especially because we want to make sure that we have better cross-browser tests. There's been more than one occasion where I've gotten a tweet and someone's like, I just opened this thing in mobile Safari and it's blank. And I'm like, ugh. It's just like, it's just, you're like crestfallen and it just sucks. And you're like, oh, damn it. So a lot of that comes from how fast we've been moving, but also the fact that there really isn't a testing library out there that's designed to work with web components. Like most of the test libraries out there are for testing JavaScript, and they assume that they can run in Phantom.js, for instance, and web components with the current release version of Phantom.js don't work. I have talked with Arya a little bit about Phantom 2.0, and it sounds like web component tests might be working there, but we haven't actually explored that just yet. But it basically, what we've been saying is if you want to test, you should probably test using something like Sauce Labs so that you can run tests in real browsers, because that's really like where things are gonna work the best. And that's also where you're gonna get the most realistic breakages. So we've been working on this project, which is up now, Polymer/web-component-tester on GitHub, and it's basically like it's still new and sort of experimental, but what we've been doing is we've basically been taking the current testing approach that we had, which was to use Mocha tests and a custom HTML suite and run those on Sauce Labs, and we've just been like tuning it up to make it a lot better. So now it is kind of a much more thoroughly documented project, and we are going to be rewriting. This may have landed. I'm not sure if it has landed just yet, but there's a pull request on our seed element project to actually switch over to using this web component tester project for all of the tests there. So if you grab the seed element project, you should get that, and then we'll also be putting it into the Yeoman generator, so that right now in the generator, every time you create a new element, or sorry, there's a sub-generator command that'll let you create a new element. And what I want is much like the Rails scaffold to basically create the element, but also create the test stub for you as well using the web component tester setup. And then you should be able to just run it on either your local machine in the browsers that you have installed, or you should be able to set it up with Sauce Labs to do like continuous integration or something like that.
Okay, so end-to-end mostly. No unit testing of your particular prototype functions or anything like that?
No, this is actually more focused kind of on prototype type stuff. It's more unit testy than like full-blown really in-depth integration tests, at least at the moment. So usually the way we do it is we'll just drop an element on the page and then be like, if I give it this attribute, this thing should pop up or something. And if I call this method, this event should fire or something. I guess I sometimes I get a little fuzzy on the difference between a unit and an integration test, but to me that feels more like a unit test. We're not at that point yet. We're still at the point of testing individual elements and making sure that they work really well.
I found too that depending on how you build the elements, if they're not very small and composable, that could be problematic. But if I have an element and I test that it does what it's supposed to end to end, and it fails, I really have no granular way to look at that. In a unit test, it does one thing. But if my element does like 4 or 5 things to get to what I'm testing,
I see.
Then, I'm testing the end result, which is valuable. But,
yeah.
And to your point, what is a unit test and what is an end-to-end test? What is a functional test? What is, BDD, TDD? There's so many different ways of thinking on it that it makes it a really difficult thing to do. But I think this is something like JavaScript. We have this idea of how we're going to test, but this is not just JavaScript anymore. This is HTML and CSS with this.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you unit test something like that? So it's not an easy problem to solve.
Yeah, it's kind of all of them knit together, as you pointed out. And what you're basically testing then is maybe it is more of like an end-to-end test if you want to think of it that way, because most of our tests are like, I set this attribute. You're going to assume that Polymer does its job and does all the bindings correctly or whatever. Maybe a change watcher fires or gets called, and then some new bit of your element renders, and then we often inspect that either using you could use get computed styles to inspect that an actual style change took place, or you could maybe see if the text content for something changed place or if an event fired. But yeah, that's typically what our tests look like at the moment. Whatever that is sort of classified as, that's really where we're at the moment.
Yeah, because we don't want to fall into that trap like where with jQuery, I had, at least with Jasmine, I'd be testing jQuery and then I'd see so many tests that just tested jQuery. They would test that this jQuery stuff worked. Well, they've tested that already. It's been battle hardened.
Right.
So
yeah, you want to avoid that for sure.
What's next for web components and the Polymer, the web component domination of the world?
I was going to say world domination, and then I see that you wrote it. Total world domination. Man, what's next? I feel like at this point we have a lot of material that explains what web components are and the sort of basics of building an element. And a lot of our tutorials and examples out there are like, let's build a few simple elements and throw them together into a little app mashup type thing. What we're missing now are the much more in-depth, more sophisticated apps and examples. And so that is what we are focusing on in the coming quarters. We want to kind of now move out of the beginner mode into the more intermediate advanced mode, where we're going to start building larger things. Topeka is kind of an example of that. That was the app that we built at I/O, the little quiz game app. We want to start building bigger things that actually run up against a lot of the harder problems that developers have, a lot of the questions developers have, where they're like, okay, cool, I get how to build an element. How do I wire this together into a sophisticated app? How do I, like you're saying, unit test the whole thing? How do I make sure it's performant? When I have a bunch of these elements all kind of chugging along on my page, how do I make sure that performance doesn't go through the floor? So that's going to be the next big thing, for at least for the developer relations side of things, and also the Polymer Eng side, because we're working with them to build these apps. The other thing that we're working on is performance. Also, of course, accessibility and internationalization has come up so many times that we're going to need to improve that as well. And also starting to separate web components from Polymer. And right now, as I said before, developers kind of conflate the two, and we really want to get to the world where people feel comfortable with web components as just this part of the web platform, and then they recognize that Polymer is just like an opinionated way to work with those things. And also that you don't have to have Polymer to use web components if you don't want to. And now that it is shipped natively in Chrome and hopefully Firefox soon, not needing the polyfills to use web components in certain situations. So yeah, it's a lot of stuff, but most of it's going to be about like, let's start making this a bit more advanced for people. Let's tackle some harder problems now. We want folks to feel totally comfortable with web components, the underlying stuff, and then they can grab the library or abstraction or tool that makes the most sense given their current project, whether that's Polymer, whether that's going to be Bosonic, or what comes next. That's the interesting part too. I'm sort of like, man, what's going to come next? Because like there's going to be somebody else that makes like a web component-y thing that's like Bosonic and Polymer and XTags, right? And so I'm always curious to see what's kind of going to like pop up on the radar there.
If people want to contact you and find out more about Polymer, find out more about working with web components in general, it's Hackademic, Polycast, how do they find you?
Yeah, the best way is on the Twitters. I'm at Rob_Dodson, Dodson, on Twitter. You can also find me on Google Plus at just +Rob Dodson.
Well, Rob, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a pleasure. I always love chatting with you, and talking web components is exciting. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This episode comes to you, at least in part, through the support and sound equipment generously supplied by 3Pillar Global. 3Pillar is a software product development company in Fairfax, Virginia, and 3Pillar is a leader in creating purposeful and innovative product experiences. 3Pillar was recently named to the Washington Post Top Workplaces list for 2014. So if you want to follow 3Pillar on the Twitters, it's at 3Pillar Global. And to find out more and see current job openings, please visit 3pillarglobal.com. That's 3, the number, pillarglobal.com. Thank you.